Do you ever feel hopeless about climate change? Do you ever feel like maybe you're not doing enough? Or maybe you're looking for a new direction for your garden? Those things might seem a little disconnected, but today I'm having a conversation with author Kate Bradbury about her new book, One Garden Against the World. I think she has a lot of ideas, she has a lot of inspiration, and she has some hope for us all about how our gardens can be tools against climate change. Okay, let's get started. So, today I am super excited to introduce to you Kate Bradbury. She is an author, an award-winning writer. Her garden and she are featured on Spring Watch and Autumn Watch and Gardener's World, which you might find on BritBox here if you're in the US. And that might be true in Canada too. I'm not actually sure. She is the wildlife editor of Gardener's World magazine and a friend of frogs, toads, foxes, and hedgehogs for sure. And she is a gardener. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Kate. Thank you
Oh,
for joining us.
thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, I feel very honored that you are here. And we're going to talk about Kate's newest book, which is One Garden Against the World in Search of Hope in a Changing Climate, which is something I think we all need right now for certain. According to my research, you are actually the only wildlife editor at a major gardening publication, which I
Oh, that's good.
think is really interesting. I could not find anyone else who is listed as a wildlife editor at a gardening publication. There are lots of them at conservation publications, but not at
Mm,
gardening. So I think that's a really big statement that
yeah.
Gardener's World is making. Uh,
It's I mean they kind of did create the job for me because I wouldn't stop going on about bees. It was very nice of them.
That's
Um, so yeah.
fantastic.
But yeah, we're paving the way. It's good. It's good.
That's really groundbreaking. I wish more, well, first of all, I wish there were more gardening magazines because we know the state of publishing is difficult, but
Very.
also that, that more would take that kind of integration um, to heart, I think. So do
Yeah.
you consider yourself a gardener? Do you consider yourself a conservationist? Both?
I'm kind of both, but I'm sort of heart and soul gardener, really. I've been gardening since I was about 3. And so yeah, I'm literally gardening all the time when I'm not having to work, obviously. Um, yeah, I'm out there all the time. And at this time of year, so in the UK, where are we? March, it's very everything's happening. I mean, I know of course in the US as well, everything's happening. And so yeah, I'm just really bit. So I find myself working very silly hours. So I'll start working at 5 in the morning because it's still dark, and I'll be working in sort of 7 in the evening because it's dark, and then I'll have a big chunk of time when I go to the allotment and plant my vegetables, or tend my start just get the year started, really. So yeah, I'm a gardener, but I'm a gardener that's always had a soft spot for other things. And I see it as my duty, my responsibility to for the little spaces that I look after, and they are small, to look after as much wildlife as possible. I feel like, I share that land with other species and I want them to be okay. Sorry if you can hear my dog shouting at the foxes, by the way.
That's okay. We're big fans of Tosca, so
Tuska's a very gentle soul, except when it comes to foxes.
that's fabulous. Mm. So your book kind of centers on hedgehogs and robins and gulls and swifts. Um, I was wondering if you'd kind of open things up and read for us a little bit.
Yes, of course.
Awesome. Unless you have a different passage, I was thinking about what was on page 96. Um,
That's fine by me.
okay.
I'm happy to do what I'm told. So starts off as it rains in the night.
Mhm.
Okay. Until when?
Wherever you feel like you want to stop.
Okay. It rains in the night, blows in on the wind and smashes against the bedroom windows. I lie awake listening to every drop, feel the earth cry with relief. Its tears run off pavements and into gutters, a brief, unexpected 5 minutes in the darkness. I think of hedgehogs getting wet for the first time in weeks. Do they run to shelter or embrace it? I think of dust washing off leaves, of raindrops disappearing into baked earth. I think of tumbling out of bed and into the garden, naked, to dance in it. It stops as instantly as it had started, but there has just been enough of it for the smell of petrichor to waft in on the breeze. In the morning, the water butt is still empty. A fat slug had been sleeping in the pipe that connects the downpipe to the water butt, and I didn't have the heart to evict it. Is it still there? I pull the pipe out from the butt. A bit of sludge comes out on my hand, followed, eventually, by the slug's little inquisitive face. Hey, slug. It shrinks back into its pipe, where it will no doubt wedge itself in and block more rain from entering the water butt. I curse myself for being so soft. But there's no more rain forecast, and I have to admit it's the perfect place for a slug to sit out a heat wave. Any more, or
Just tell us a little bit about the background of this passage and what's happening.
what's happening? So I wrote this book in 2022, and the whole point of the book was that it would start in spring and it would end in winter. So it would sort of have this sort of 12-month cycle of, and I wanted to write something about the planet and climate change and biodiversity loss and all the things that I'm doing in my garden, in the hope that other people could, that it was inspire other people to do stuff in their gardens too. And I didn't anticipate, I had no way of knowing, obviously, that there was going to be a huge drought in the UK that year. And it was the worst drought since the big drought of 1976. It was worse than 1976. It was, whew. And I live in a very dry part of the country anyway. I live in Brighton, which doesn't get that much rain anyway, but it was really dry. And we got to 40 degrees Celsius temperature wise for the first time. And it was scary. Everything was on fire. And it was really scary. And we had the dog, and the dog was only 2. And we were really worried about her paws getting hot on the pavement. I mean, I know, lots of parts of the US are very, very hot. And
Mhm.
so you're used to the things that I'm describing. But I think for us in the UK, certainly me, who's so in tune with what's going on with the natural world that has evolved with our very temperate climate, it was just really shocking. And seeing species struggle to survive, finding dead bees all over the pavement, seeing butterflies come into the garden that normally wouldn't come in, and the robins, I ended up feeding them, and they were fine in the end because I was feeding them. But yeah, just seeing everything sort of just fall apart a little bit. And so that was what the passage was about, really. That was the first bit of rain we had, and it was only 5 minutes. But I wanted to go and dance naked in the garden to celebrate it. So yeah. I know obviously it hasn't stopped bloody raining since that 2022. So it started raining in autumn 2022 and it's literally not stopped. It's been the wettest weather I've ever known. But that's climate change, isn't it? It's one thing or the other thing, yeah,
The norms are not normal anymore.
and not normal. They're
Yeah.
not normal. It's actually not, it's actually okay at the moment, although it's suddenly gone really cold. But I
Hmm.
mean, spring does do that.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, I'm just worried because last year we had all the bumblebees came out, and I was really grateful to see lots of bumblebees after a very wet winter, and then they all disappeared. And it's because, well, the scientists all sort of crunched numbers and tried to work out what happened. And because we had a very cold, wet spring, sort of quite late, and so they came out of hibernation. They need to keep their nests at an average of 30 degrees Celsius. And then they just couldn't because of all the cold and the wet. And the rain was obviously destroying lots of flowers, and the cold was making it harder for them to keep their nests warm. So a lot of nests failed. And now I've seen a few bumblebees. There's not many because there weren't that many last year, but there's a few. And I've been really sort of quietly happy because it's been sunny and it's been quite mild and it's been quite dry. Slightly too dry, but okay. And now suddenly it's freezing and it's snowing in some parts of the UK. So suddenly I'm worried about the bumblebees again. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. That's what my book's about. It's basically about my climate anxiety and how I'm dealing with it, which is through gardening.
I think it's fantastic because it's a way to cultivate. I mean, when you are connected and you are watching and you are observing, you're seeing this and developing this empathy for the creatures around you.
Yeah.
And, recognizing that what is happening to the planet is happening to us, but it is also happening to every other organism that inhabits this planet as well.
Yeah.
And that is, we really, through like the in-depth observations, the things that you have done, for example, that's really how we are going to see and know that, aside from data from scientists, which sometimes is very difficult to absorb because it can be overwhelming. Um, and it speaks to a very different part of our brains and our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not always very relatable, is it? They say these things as scientists, and what's 1.5 degrees to your average person? What's 5 meters of sea level rise? And so, yeah, I tried to do stuff. I tried to sort of take the science and just relay it into sort of, it's not even layman's terms, just into sort of like a sort of emotional, like living person terms, if you like. Just it's how I see what's happening. Yeah, it's worrying. It is really worrying. But I've sort of just spent all of my life now just trying to make my little patch of earth better, and it keeps me busy if nothing else.
So tell us some of the things that you have done as a gardener to make your garden more hospitable to your local wildlife, and what have you done?
Okay. Sorry. Um, so it's a very small garden, so that's the main thing. So everything I grow, apart from daffodils, is for wildlife. So I've got a beautiful crabapple tree that is beautiful, and I love it. It's Everest.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Love it. It's just about to blossom. I'm very excited. So it's beautiful for me, but obviously the bees love the flowers in spring because it's a small garden. I try to get plants that work for more than one species, so they have a very long season of usefulness.
Mhm.
So moths will lay eggs on leaves because that's kind of a native-ish species. Obviously, the flowers are used by pollinators. The crabs, the crab apples, are eaten by blackbirds and robins. And then as the tree ages, then lots of bark, little gnarly barky bits will provide sort of hibernation spots for other insects. And being a tree, you plant it and it takes up sort of a very small sort of pillar of space, and then it sort of flowers into the sky. So I think we should be cramming more trees into our gardens. And what else do I do? I've got various climbing roses and rambling roses. They've all got single open flowers for pollinators to get to. They've got floppy leaves, which is really important. So leafcutter bees can use them to make their nests. I always leave the hips in autumn. I don't cut the hips away until the squirrels have stopped eating them. So I watch the squirrels eat them, which is lovely. And I've got a friend who grows one of the same roses as me, and he's had blackbirds feasting on his rose hips as well. So potentially that could be, another source of food. And again, they're just beautiful. They make me so happy. I've trained one of my climbing roses, Francis C. Leicester, all along the one side of my garden on my trellis. And it's now gone beyond the trellis on either side. So I'm trying to train it to go over the shed on one side and then up the house on the other. So yeah, I mean, I'm always being a gardener, thinking about what's going to look nice for me, but
Mhm.
in the context of how it can also work for wildlife. Um, I sort of, yeah, in the front garden, I've got a little meadow. I chucked a load of sand in a corner to see if mining bees would use it. I make these little habitats, these little nesting habitats for bees using mud and using bee hotels and using sand and different materials. I try to create opportunities wherever possible and just grow loads of flowers, loads of leaves that moths can lay eggs on. And then as a gardener again, just not taking everything down in autumn, just sort of thinking, I mean, we know all this now, don't we, as gardeners? We know to not do a big autumn tidy because lots of species hibernate in amongst all the waste. And it kind of disappears anyway. I've never really understood. You do this big autumn tidy and you're just doing this work that doesn't need to be doing, because by the time the wind and the rain and everything else has had a go at it, there's nothing left to tidy away. I mean, it's absolutely minimal. So yeah, I'm just very mindful. I just think about things. I think, who's going to live here? What's the impact of this? If I cut something down, I'll chuck it. I'll just leave it on the floor for a few days. So anything that was there can sort of mosey on back onto some living bits of plants. If I chuck stuff in the compost bin, I'll leave the lid off for a couple of days. So anything can just sort of make its way out if it wants to. Just thinking beyond myself as the gardener, really, just thinking of who else lives here, who is benefiting or not benefiting from me doing this. How can I do this more respectfully or more gently? But yeah, I mean, it's all largely gardening, really. I just try to tread more gently.
Very clearly. You talk about collecting your rainwater or your shower water and the water that you bathe your dog in and all of those
Yeah,
things, which are things that in some parts of the US, for example, we're very keen about that, especially when we're having a drought. And then in other parts of the US, that's not really something that people do because and I've lived in California where like we had to be extremely cautious about water usage at times. So
wow,
gray water was really important. And now I live in Colorado and it depends on the snowpack.
wow,
Um some years we have plenty of water and some years we are really struggling, and our water feeds the snowpack from the Colorado Rocky Mountains provides water to like 70 million people in 5 states.
wow,
So, yeah,
wow,
it's pretty astonishing, actually, the way how we are so interconnected across enormous swaths of the country. So,
wow. Amazing.
yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Sometimes you just don't want to hear these things, do you? It's like, it's all too big. Um,
You know?
the shower bucket thing is something that's actually stayed since the drought for me. I ended up going and buying a bucket that matched my bathroom, and it just lives there now. And yeah, it's just one bucket a day, but I use it. I use it to water plants. I use it to. I'm slightly obsessed with the dog weeing all over my garden. So every time she goes for a wee, I've turned into my granddad. I chase her around the garden with a watering can. So yeah, I always use the water, and it just means, we've had just a huge, terrible run of wet weather. But in the southeast of the UK, we've only got a finite resource and loads of houses being built. There's loads more people coming in. So I try not to use tap water as much as, for frivolous things like gardening. So yeah, I try to use my water butts, but because it's been quite dry for the last few weeks, I've suddenly put another dish in the washing up bowl in the kitchen sink now as well, just because I don't want to be using my precious resource of rainwater from the water butts. So yeah, the drought has definitely made me more hyper aware of water shortages, whereas previously I might have just turned on the hose.
Sure. So thinking about that, tell us a little bit about your pond. Are your frogs swimming?
My frogs, they've quieted down, thank goodness. So yes, for anyone who doesn't follow me on Instagram, every spring I have, it just feels like all of the frogs in Brighton just come to my pond. There's just millions of them, and there's always like a couple that start, and it's always very quiet, and then there's just like a tipping point, and I don't know if like there's a certain temperature, or we get a bit of rain, or there's a certain number of frogs come, and it's like their hormones just take over, and they just get carried away, and they don't they don't care, and so it's just for about 5 days, every spring, the pond is just a writhing mass of frog bodies, and it is, I mean, it's quite intense. It's, I feel embarrassed looking at them. And I've got this camera for Christmas that it's like Wi-Fi, and I only look on my phone so I can sort of turn it on without disturbing them and see them. Yeah, that's calm down now. My garden's just full of. I saw my first tadpoles today actually, which is
Oh,
really good because the pond is now so full of algae, that I need all of those tadpoles to hatch and start eating it.
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
That's wonderful. We have
yeah.
tried. We put a pond in 4 years ago, in our yard. But we are not anywhere near a water source really.
Okay.
And so I know that there are native frogs here, but they have not shown up at
Okay.
all, which is kind of sad. So especially sad for my son who is actually obsessed with frogs.
Oh.
So yes, we have pet frogs in our house, in fact, but
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Okay.
but we have not yet attracted the wild, they're leopard frogs is the kind of frog that we should be getting. So
Oh.
I don't
Well,
know.
come.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
may
they
have to go steal some tadpoles out of a
come.
pond somewhere. I know. We but we have to get the right kind because there's also an invasive frog and there's all these issues. They're bullfrogs that are eating all of the native frogs and yeah, it's not good.
And be careful of diseases too, because there's loads of amphibian diseases these days.
Yep,
Um,
exactly.
yeah.
But so I was rereading your passage last night about frogs to my son and he was like he's
Right.
13, he can
Oh,
handle it, but he was like,
oh.
whoa.
But I think I put a couple of videos in, didn't I? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about
Oh no, it's awesome.
that.
It's
Oh.
super cool.
I should be
So
getting toads any day now. Like there've been a couple about, but I've not had any toad spawn yet. I usually get a little bit of toad spawn. But now it's gone cold again. I don't know when they're gonna come.
they are unpredictable, those toads.
Yeah.
So speaking of kids and kind of their entry point into gardening, mine is obsessed with frogs, and so we have a pond and
Mhm.
other things. But how about you write about Stanley, your nephew,
Yes.
who seems to have the gene.
He does. He
I love
does.
So how is he as a natural gardener? I mean, now he must be 5 or 6. And
He's 5, yeah.
yeah.
What's he doing? I bought him a bird box for Christmas actually. So I went up the other week and I put his bird box up for him. Because obviously his parents didn't put it up for him. Yeah, I mean he's 5. And so whenever we do gardening together, he's always really good. I think I wrote in the book about he was deadheading daffodils and he just knew the difference between a developing tulip head and a dead daffodil within seconds, and he was 3. Um, so yeah, he's very good, and he's very comfortable with it. And there was one time I wanted to cry. It was so sad. I sort of turned up, and we all had to be at a family event. And he just went into the shed and he got all of his gardening tools out because Auntie Kate was there. And Auntie Kate's the only one who does gardening with him. But we all had to go to this thing that nobody wanted to go to. Um, so yeah, I think I am trying to nurture it, but he's not. I live quite far away from him, and he's not got any other influence, shall we say. My mum does a bit, but yeah, I don't know. I think when he's old enough to come and stay with me, that's when it might be. We might sort of, have some allotment time, and he can set up a little vegetable patch or something like that. But yeah, it's quite tricky doing it from afar with his parents, as useless as they are.
So what do you think about, like, what are the kinds of things that you do? I know that you do kind of community work, and you've talked about having nature tables and all of those kinds of things. How do you get kids involved in gardening? What kinds of things do you see as being useful?
What kind of things? I think giving them their own space is really important. That's obviously not something I can do with nature tables. I think having loads of really cool things on nature tables is always good. Because then the kids want to sort of, they want to take them home with them. And you're like, no, I've got to display this all day. That's really nice. I did one. I did one where at the end of the day, I just said to these kids, just come back and you can all take one thing, but promise me you'll learn about the species and you'll spend your life looking after it. And they were like, oh yes, I will. Yes, thank you. Yes. I gave them all some skulls, which their parents were delighted about. I just think, yeah, I mean, my nephews of my nephew. I've got another nephew now. He's only one. But yeah, they're quite small, and so I try with them, but I'm not hugely experienced with I haven't got kids of my own with actually trying to engage kids. My next door neighbours, they've got kids on both sides actually, and one neighbour's got plastic lawn, and the other neighbour's got paved garden. So I'm sort of surrounded on either sides by not very nice environments, and they've got young kids, and so I just I tried to sort of engage them by saying, hey, do you want some frog spawn? Do you want to come and see the frogs? Do you want to look at the fox, because the fox that sits on my shed every day? And just try to engage them that way. And often they'll already be out there saying, oh wow, cool, what's this? And then I'll say, oh well, this is this, or this is this. I had a very cool bee nesting in one of my bee hotels a couple of years ago, and the neighbours just happened to be walking past with their kids, and so I sort of showed them. So I do stuff like that. I try to engage kids, and obviously I've set up a little hedgehog group, and lots of kids came to my hedgehog talk and talked about hedgehogs. So I've got loads of kids, and it's really nice actually. So I walk down the street and kids say hi to me, and they tell me about their hedgehogs and they tell me about their frogs. And so we're sort of on the same level in that respect, which I like. I am basically 10 years old. So yeah, I try, but I wouldn't say I was very confident about it. Maybe when my nephew's a bit older, I'll sort of have some definitive answers. But at the moment, I'm just sort of bumbling through and seeing what sticks.
I think that's great. And I love that, you're the frog lady in your neighborhood and the hedgehog lady in your neighborhood.
Yeah, I am.
I'm jealous of your hedgehogs.
Oh, I know. No, all Americans are. Yeah, I love my hedgehogs. They came out last night, the night before. Yeah, 2 nights ago. So they've been hibernating, and it's really normal for hedgehogs to hibernate all winter and come out in March, but they haven't behaved normally in the 6 years I've lived here. So I've just been worrying all winter because there's always one that comes out and has a bit of food every couple of nights over winter, and there just hasn't been. They've actually properly hibernated. So yeah, and they're all good. They're all a good size, which always makes me happy. So yeah, we'll see what this season brings for them.
How many do you have this winter?
How many hedgehogs? I mean, I don't know. In sort of the busiest months are May, June, and July, and I reckon I've got about 15 coming in regularly. But they walk 2 kilometers a night in search of food and a mate. What's that in miles? I'm like 1 and a bit miles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little more. So yeah.
So that they, there's this and they have these little patches. So they'll spend 2 or 3 weeks in sort of one area, and they'll eat all of the foods they can find in that one area, and then they'll go to another area and then eat all of that food. So they kind of, yeah, they're kind of working different patches. But I do have some regulars, like my three-legged Houdini. He doesn't wander very far. He just goes over to Lynn's over road and has different types of biscuits, and then comes back to me. Yeah. But yeah, they keep me entertained.
Tell us a little bit about kind of the concept, because this is pretty foreign to American gardeners, I think. This idea of having kind of wildlife channels that a hedgehog, for example, can get from yard to yard to yard. Um,
Uh,
and garden to garden. That isn't something that is very common here. And yet, I think even though we don't have hedgehogs, it might be something we need to think about.
yeah, I mean, that might be why you haven't got frogs.
It could be.
So we call them wildlife corridors.
Mhm.
And the idea is that, we've got our gardens, they've all been segregated into these sort of separate sort of definitive spaces, and they're all surrounded by walls and marked, set apart by walls and fences and things, and they're quite impermeable. So birds and bees and flying things can get in and out, but anything that crawls or walks or hops or slithers can't. And so we create these wildlife corridors, which could be anything from, a hole under a gate,
Mhm.
or you could cut a little square out of a gate. So hedgehogs need about 13 centimeters squared, about the size of a CD. For those who know what CDs are. Um, and yeah. So I've got the hole under my gate, and then I've got very old Victorian walls. So it's quite easy to punch holes in the walls. One of them's too big, and foxes use it, which is a bit annoying because then they trample all over my flower beds. So I'm going to have to try and make it smaller. But foxes can jump anyway, so I'm not denying the foxes. Just so you know, I'm just trying to stop them treading all over my flowers. So yeah, and the idea is the more gardens that are open up this way, the more the hedgehogs, particularly, that lots of people call them hedgehog highways, can travel between gardens, so they don't have to go onto the road. So potentially, the more you connect gardens, the more gardens that are connected, potentially a hedgehog never needs to see a car, and that's really, a huge benefit of this is that a hedgehog never has to see a car. Because hedgehogs do get squished quite a lot on the roads. So yeah, they're good. They're good. And then lots of things come in. I get slow worms, which is a type of lizard with no legs.
Mhm.
Some gardens will get grass snakes. There's frogs, there's toads, there's newts, there's all sorts of things that will come in. If you let them in, then your garden becomes part of the wider landscape. And if it's part of the wider landscape, then everything you do also benefits the landscape. So yeah, it's good. It's good. It's a good rewilding. It's a good thing to do. Definitely.
That's fantastic. I have in my garden, my back garden is completely fenced off. My front garden is completely open.
Okay.
And I have thought about, well, maybe we need to open some little holes, but we have rattlesnakes. Yeah. So I'm not a big fan of rattlesnakes.
Yeah. I can't imagine why.
And we have skunks, which I actually really love skunks, but skunks
Okay.
and dogs do not get along well, and I have two dogs. So skunks are so stinky, but they are they are fantastic at, like, they take care of mice problems, and they like, they're an integral part of urban and suburban and wildlife in general. But having them tangle with your dogs is not a good idea. So
No. Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can't imagine Tosca getting on well with a skunk. Although
Yeah,
she looks like a skunk. Um,
we
yeah.
had we had one in our yard one time. So this is a silly story, but I got up in the middle of the night. My dog needed to go out, and I let her out, and suddenly there was this bark, 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 bark. And I knew something was in the yard, and it was either probably a skunk or a raccoon. And so I went out, and she had a skunk cornered. And when skunks are cornered, they rise up on their front feet and put their tails and their back legs in the air to make themselves look bigger.
Okay.
They kind of stand on their front legs, and so like that's the warning not to spray. That the next thing they'll do
Oh,
is spray you. And fortunately, I was able to get the dog away from the skunk and let the skunk do its thing before either one of us got sprayed.
what does it smell like?
It's like the nastiest smell you've ever smelled in your whole life.
Wow.
Mm.
Okay.
And like if a skunk sprays, you can smell it blocks away.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
it's overpowering, and getting a dog clean after they've been skunked is it's really a task.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So it's one of those unique North American challenges.
Wow.
But they're everywhere, and they're wonderful because, and I think a lot of people think of them as nuisances because you think about how inconvenient it is. It's a very oily spray, and it, I guess, stings the eyes, but the smell is just like it's overpowering. But they're really important because they eat mice and they eat voles, and they also eat lots and lots of insects, and they aerate the land, dig it up and find grubs, and all kinds of things like that. So they're really important ecologically, but it's one of those things that's hard to kind of come to a détente.
Okay. Wow.
Fortunately, they're not really endangered at all.
So,
So
so you don't feel bad about blocking them out of your garden?
no,
Oh,
not here anyway.
oh. Well, maybe for your frogs then. I don't know how big your frogs are, but you can make a tiny little corridor that's just
I
frog
would
size.
have to do that. Yeah,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that's small enough for frogs.
Yeah. The skunks can't get through.
Be selective about what can come in.
Yeah.
Oh, so I was thinking about, I loved the passage on page 116 where you
Oh,
talked about hedgehogs in particular, and I know that Americans love hedgehogs. We covet your hedgehogs. So I was wondering if you'd read to us a little bit about hedgehogs.
okay. 116. Should I start on 115 and start about mini? Or should I start about wildlife rescue centres?
It's up to you. You're the author.
Okay. A few weeks ago, during some of the driest, hottest weather we have ever seen in this part of the world, a woman spotted a hedgehog out during the day as it was climbing into a drain pipe on a busy high street. She acted quickly and grabbed the hedgehog before it could get stuck. It would never have been able to get out again, and took it straight to the rescue centre, where it was found to be dehydrated and starving, along with all the other hogs that had been taken in since very early spring. The little hog was weighed 400 grams, sexed a female, and named Minnie as she was so small. She was given water and food in gentle doses so as not to overwhelm her little system, and her own cage filled with soft bedding. She settled into the hoggy hospital well. Some hogs hate it and resist every attempt to care for them. They remain very firmly wild. But Minnie seemed to know what was good for her. She's a delight, says Anne, who brings her round to be released in my garden. She's a little darling. Wildlife rescue centres are jam-packed with hedgehogs this year. They seem to have struggled more than most in the hot, dry weather. Hedgehogs come out of hibernation in early spring and refuel on juicy caterpillars, worms and beetles, rehydrating from puddles and ponds. It's all timed so perfectly. After winter dormancy, the longer days and warmer temperatures encourage leaves to unfurl and flowers to blossom. Some of the year's first insects feed on the blossom, and others lay eggs on the leaves, while the warmer soil brings worms to the surface. April showers provide moisture, but not too much. Just enough for seeds to germinate, but not enough to wash caterpillars off leaves. Just enough for a little puddle to form, but not enough to completely saturate the soil. Spring, it's the uncoiling of everything. It's a little bit of bounce. Hello, says everyone, blinking in the spring sunshine. Nom, says the hedgehog. Nom, says the baby bird. Nom, 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 say the wasps and the badgers and the slowworms and the bees, who are all bouncing, uncoiled too, with the sudden abundance of everything.
You think about spring and it coming, and we all welcome it so much, but of course, it
They
means
do too. They do too. It must be so amazing to just be a hedgehog and just finally wake up and be like, yes. Oh, after just being curled into a tight ball all winter.
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
So what do you do when you face this drought? Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you did to care for the wildlife that did come to your garden, and attract more so that it could be a place of respite, because of course they were suffering in ways that we don't necessarily.
Yes. So at the moment, we can all turn a tap on and get drinking water, and we've still got food in the shops. So lots of wild species, that all cuts off when there's a drought. So worms retreat really deep into the soil. Caterpillars tend to sort of wither and die off leaves. So there's just not much food. Lots of insects generally will just hide and shelter where it's damp and cool rather than just be out and about. So as a gardener, I made sure there was always water. So water in the bird baths. I've got a bird bath this high. I've got a bird bath on the ground. I've got a little bowl. I've got the pond, obviously. I tried to keep the pond topped up, but as you may remember from the book, my partner let me down on that one quite badly. Still hasn't recovered. And watering plants. So I think the biggest thing to remember in a drought is that flowers stop producing nectar. So that's why there were so many dead bees all around. It's because there's not much nectar in the plants, in the flowers. They stop, and so that sort of reduces the bees' opportunity to live, basically to fly around, to have energy to do anything. So I was using grey water. So this is why I was so obsessed with grey water. I didn't want to use mains water. I was using grey water to water my garden, to keep leaves plump so that insects could lay eggs on them, whatever, have a little munch. I was keeping flowers watered so that they would keep producing nectar. And like I said earlier, I had species that you don't normally get in an urban garden coming in to feed from my flowers. And I think that's because in the wider habitat, in the wider landscape, everything was really dry, and I was creating this little oasis in my garden. And then other things I did, I had a family of robins nesting in the garden, and I dug up earthworms for them, and I took worms out of my compost bin. And then in week 2, when the chicks were a bit older, I went and bought some mealworms and just sort of left them in water in a really out of the way part of the garden. And they loved that. And luckily, the starlings and the sparrows didn't find the little stash of mealworms until the robins had fledged, so it was all good. So yeah, just stuff like that. And obviously, the hedgehogs. Hedgehogs drink so much. They will just sit there. I've got video footage. I've got sort of 2-minute long video footage of hedgehogs drinking. It's really boring, but they just drink and drink and drink and drink. So it's really important for hedgehogs to have lots and lots of water to drink. And obviously I was feeding them as well. And that's all you can do, I think. Creating shade. That's something that I'll sort of look into doing in the future. The garden's bigger now, but I think, maybe just sort of putting a sort of sail over or something to sort of create a bit of shade for certain species like foxes maybe. But I think, yeah, water's the main thing, and food, and then any other opportunities. What I've done since, I've made a climate change bunker for frogs.
Oh, tell us about this.
So I had my patio done last autumn, or the autumn just before, and while I was doing it, I said, right, I want all of the rainwater that comes off the roof to stay in the garden. I don't want it to go into the sewers, because we've got a problem in the UK with our sewage. Well, just masses and masses of underinvestment over the years has meant that whenever it rains heavily, our lovely water companies just pump raw sewage into the sea and into rivers, which is really bad. So the more of us that don't let any water go into the sewers, the better that will be for everyone. And also that just keeps my little water table higher for longer, which means that potentially the next time we get a drought, the garden will be more hydrated. Who knows? I've got a land drain. So the land drain goes along the length of the garden. And I was like, hang on a minute. The land drain sort of comes off the roof, down the pipe, under the patio, into this little drain that's sort of 1.5 meters below ground. That sounds like it would be a really nice habitat for frogs. So I filled the first bit of the pipe with rocks, and I've made a little ladder for them. And then I've got what are they called? So they're called, you know, the grid things that you get on driveways, so that everyone's where the water goes and then it goes.
Yeah.
So I've made a little gap in the grid so that a frog can get down. And so yeah, and they use it, they love it. It's great. Yeah. And it's, I mean, I'll probably never be able to move house, or if I do move house, I'll have to explain this, you know, you must make sure the ladder stays intact, otherwise I'll be stuck. But yeah, no, they're very happy. And you know, we haven't had much hot sunny weather since the drought, but I reckon the next time we do get hot sunny weather, whether it's a drought or not, the frogs will retreat down there because it's lovely and cool and moist.
That's fantastic.
I know, I love it.
Idea.
I love it. Everyone who had a land drain could make it, could repurpose it as a climate change bunker for frogs. Honestly, just a few rocks and a little ladder, you'll be fine. Well away.
That's fabulous.
Yeah,
And of
I'm going to do some stuck on it one day.
Amphibians are both a bellwether for kind of change and a signifier of how much things are changing, but also they're an important piece of any kind of local food web.
Yeah.
Because they're food for birds and they're food for all kinds of other creatures as well. So that's really amazing.
I just know that whatever happens, my frogs will be all right. They can just go down there and they can spend, or it's probably full of slugs. It's probably, yeah, they can just go down there and have a really nice time.
That's awesome. Well done. So you are so clearly and carefully observant of the wildlife in your garden. Do you keep a gardening journal? Do you kind of mark the seasons? How do you do that?
No, I kind of, part of me wishes I did. I'm not a very organized person. I'm full of ideas and I can see my ideas out, but I'm not very good at keeping. I've tried to set up journals before and it doesn't work. So I tend to post things on Instagram, and so I use Instagram as my journal. So sometimes I can look back and see my first frog spawn date was when I posted it on Instagram. Also, I think if I marked the changing of the seasons for everything, like the first swift of the year, the first primrose of the year, the first frog spawn, I think I'd go mad because it's changing so much at the moment. I mean, my frog spawn, I have got about 10 years of data actually. I think frogs are the only things that I've sort of written down over the years. And you know, for years and years, well, for the first sort of six to 8 years of living here, they would just spawn in the 3rd week of February. That's what they did every year. They spawned in the 3rd week of February. Occasionally 18th of Feb, but normally it would be the 3rd week. And then since 2020, it's just jumped and jumped and jumped and jumped. And this year they spawned for the first time in January, and that was really quite challenging for me. And I just, when these things happen, I have to sort of dust myself off, spend some time on my own for a couple of days, and then go back on it because I'm determined to enjoy it. I'm determined to have a nice time and enjoy the frogs and enjoy spring and all of the lovely nature things. But I think if I was too obsessive over dates and firsts, I would just sort of end up in a bit of a dark place for too long, really.
I get that.
Hmm.
You did, you write about creating the cage to protect the robins and as they were getting ready to fledge. How interventional are you when it comes to helping and preserving the wildlife, especially like when you get a sudden cold snap after the frogs have spawned and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the robins, I was very, very on edge, and um, I mean, it worked.
Mhm.
It worked, and I was, would I build a cage around a bird's nest again? I probably would because it's such an urban area, and there's so many cats and other predators. I just wanted to protect those robins. Um, but normally I'm not that interfery, you
Mhm.
know. I've got so much frog spawn that if I get a bit of frost on the pond, I don't worry too much. I do push if there's any frog spawn that's really sticking out, I will push it down a little bit below the surface, and that's usually enough. But I don't cry over a little bit of frog spawn that's sort of not survived. I've got buckets. I mean, it's disgusting. So yeah, it's yeah. And then I don't know if something needs feeding, then yeah, I'll feed it. I think you have to be quite a hard person to sort of not do that. But yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, it depends really. It depends if I see a spider eating a fly or if I see a spider eating a bee, if it's a queen bumblebee in spring, then I'll probably interfere. And if not, then yeah,
Recognizing that it's somebody's food. So,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, speaking of interventions, the drone bastard, is he
Oh
still at it?
God. Yeah. He's not properly started this year, but actually I've got everything crossed. I've got two seagulls on my roof and I think they're going to nest for the first time. So I'm really excited. He doesn't come as far as my roof. Well, actually, the roofs he does affect, all of the seagulls get really upset. So it will upset my seagulls, but his drone won't come onto my roof. So yeah, it's I think we've just all got to a point where
Would you tell everybody a little bit about
yeah,
the
sorry. So
bastard?
we live in Brighton. We get a lot of seagulls. They nest on the roofs, and we've got this guy who doesn't like them very much, and so he flies a drone at the nests to try and stop them. It's extremely upsetting. We've spent 2-3 years now trying to get the police involved, trying to get various charities involved, and we've not managed to succeed. But what we have noticed is that he hasn't stopped the birds nesting. They have continued to nest. So yeah, we just have to accept that that's what it is, really.
Yeah. So no progress on that front.
No progress on that front, no.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to particularly talk about?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think you've asked some really lovely questions. It doesn't matter how small your yard is, every bit can make a difference. I mean, I don't in the UK, only 5% of all land mass is gardens, which seems pointless. It seems like, why would we even bother? But all of our gardens put together still take up more space than all of our nature reserves. And our nature reserves in the UK aren't managed in the same way that they are in the States. They're all owned privately and managed really badly. So we, I think looking at the bigger picture and being overwhelmed and feeling that you can't make a difference doesn't help anybody. Whereas looking at the small things you can do, um, you can save a bee, you can save a butterfly, you can save a frog. And all of that stuff actually can stack up. And the more of us that do it in our gardens, the more, reserves will have. I've just written a piece for The Guardian about my tiny front garden. It's ridiculous. In the UK, a lot of us have front gardens with no driveway, and so we sort of pave over our gardens to park cars. But mine's too small to do that. You couldn't actually park a car on my front garden. It's really tiny. It's about the size of a double bed, like a really big double bed, like a super king or something, but it's not a big space for a garden. But I've got like nesting hairy-footed flower bees in it. And where would they nest if they didn't have that little space? And just imagine if all of our front gardens, rather than being these places to park cars, had little nesting spaces for hairy-footed flower bees. That would be lovely. And I think that's worth doing. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say really. We have to just keep plugging away at what we can do.
I loved the last part of your book, where you have the 30 million gardens for the planet. And there's a very clear and very helpful list of things that people can do. And you say it's not one garden against the world. It's 30 million gardens, 27,000 parks, and countless balconies and roof gardens for the planet. And that's very inspiring, because when we think about, and here in the US too, the idea that, all these vast swaths of immaculate green grass, if part of each of those yards was turned into habitat, because those yards just don't support anything. But if part of them were turned into habitat, we could, one by one, make a difference.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are watching this who are in the US, there is a movement. And it's
American Prairie again.
Yes.
Yes.
It's called the Homegrown National Park Movement. And I'll put a link down below to it, but it is, it's really inspiring, actually, talking about planting native plants and restoring part of your yard, if not the entire yard. And there are lots of great resources too. And this is just kind of, in many ways, I feel like we're very behind the UK in that, but we don't have the same gardening culture that you do, which is, there's not the same kind of history. Garden is vegetable gardens, and then you landscape your lawn and you just kind of leave it. And that is kind of the standard way of thinking about, even though we have bigger yards and more land on average. I mean, my lot is smaller than the standard kind of suburban lot, and yet I'm guessing it's probably at least 5 times the area that you have.
Wow. Wow.
I know. I'm having to guess about that, but I from what I have seen on television and what you have shared, I would guess it's probably at least that.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. So like, we have a lot to work with.
Yeah.
And we have the very same problems that you have with species collapse and mass extinctions happening, especially in insect life, Lepidoptera. I mean, and as a result, crashing populations of birds. And we have an epidemic of bird flu right now that is, I don't know how we're going to recover from this epidemic of bird flu, because it is taking out, it started in wild birds and it is taking them all out.
Yeah.
It's really scary.
We had bird flu in Brighton 2 years ago, and it affected a lot of our seagulls in particular. And last year I noticed, because they nest in the same place every year, and I noticed the empty rooftops, and it was really, really sad. But again, I did what I do, and I ended up fostering baby seagulls that had fallen from roofs and setting them free, and being part of the movement to repopulate Brighton with seagulls. And now I've been rewarded by potentially, this is the chimney that they're on. I'm just touching the chimney. Potentially having, seagull chicks on my roof. And I think at the moment, potentially, I mean, I don't know if I'm just being really ridiculous and non-scientific, but has bird flu passed through Brighton? Have we seen the worst of it? Could this be it? Or is it just going to come back with a vengeance in 2 years' time and just knock everything out? I don't know. But surely, I know that diseases are pretty scary these days. I know that COVID is, I read lots of very scary things about COVID, but surely there's at some point there's going to be some immunity, and there's going to be, and if we provide the habitats for these species to bounce back, then they will bounce back. I think that's the worrying thing, isn't it? That they're knocked by climate, they're knocked by biodiversity loss, then they're knocked by disease. And in any other scenario, it's they'll just bring their numbers back, and then it's like, well, how?
Right.
But we've just got to do everything we can to make sure we do what's in our power to make sure they can. So I hope your birds are going to be okay.
I hope so too. So on that very sad note, I ask you, where do you find hope?
Where do I find hope? Gosh, in the garden. In the garden. I think I do go through periods of feeling really not hopeful. I'm not really joyful and cheerful all the time. I do sort of sink into myself. So yeah, lots of people ask me this question now. Why are you so happy? And I'm like, I'm not. But I think for me, spring, whatever happens, spring has to happen. Things have to grow, things have to emerge from the soil. Spring has to happen. It might be early, it might be late, it might all come at once, it might come in the wrong order, all of these things, but it has to happen. And I have just decided to take joy from spring. So far this year, I've said hello to 3 species of bumblebee. I've obviously been obsessed with my frogs. The hairy-footed flower bees are out. I can't wait to see my first bee fly of the year. I can't wait to see my first red mason bee of the year. The swifts will be returning on the 5th of May or thereabouts. I'm excited to see these things again. And yes, it's going to be rough. There's going to be all sorts of things that are going to happen to them. Drone Man's going to be about. Lots of building work goes on around Brighton that stops swifts nesting in their homes. There's going to be hedgehogs that are in trouble. But for now, I'm just really happy to see them again. And that's the joy I take. I try not to look too hard into the future. I try to spend as much of my time now, like in the moment, enjoying stuff now. And yeah, and sowing seeds and tilling the soil and listening to birdsong and laughing at frogs. That's what I take joy from today. Yeah.
That is fabulous. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like, I don't know, it has been a lovely chat, and I just appreciate your generosity, and I hope all of you. This is Kate Bradbury's book, One Garden Against the World, and it's marvelous. And you can find her on Instagram. Her Instagram is really lovely, and also Stack too. So thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate it.
You too, Angela. It's been great. Thank you for having me.